Hello and welcome to Sacred Book, a respectful, in-depth conversation of both the Tanakh and the New Testament, from a atheistic, that's my point of view, Mark, and a theistic point of view, which is...
Mine, Steve, and I didn't even drink the tea.
You didn't. You may do so now, sir.
Thank you.
There is an absolute shedload of shorts connected to this because, believe it or not, we've almost done 3.5 hours at least on this. However, I think it was the third episode, Steve, you made a comment that you missed out talking about Jesus' presence at the very beginning of Genesis. And therefore, off air, we said, well, this is an opportunity for a quick summation. I say quick, this is Steve I'm talking to now. A summation, and you got 15 minutes max of how you would link it with Christ. Are you okay at that?
We can certainly have a look at that and we'll see how we go. How's that?
Off you go.
I'm quite interested in seeing where the God that I worship, being Jesus, is represented early on in the Tanakh, in the Jewish scriptures. And so if you take Jesus at his word, he said that the volume of the book, the Tanakh, the law, the prophets, the writings, they speak of me. And so somewhere within all of this writing, you will find him if you look for him. That's always sort of intrigued me as to how that could possibly be the case. We were looking at the Spirit of God hovering over the water. I did some work some years ago now on the miracles of Jesus. I don't have a problem with the supernatural in so much as I'm not somebody who doesn't believe that miracles can happen, but I don't believe that miracles happen in the way that some people who profess a Christian belief consider that they do. Almost like you push the cosmic bell button and God comes running to do your will. I'm not sure that it works like that at all, and I don't think that's the case. And so I started out looking at the miracles of Jesus, not through the lens of the supernatural, but through the lens of how did these show messianic credentials? That there would have been some sort of expectation in every miracle as to how that speaks into the messianic credentials. Which brings me back to Genesis, because I was looking at the account in Matthew and Mark, which is Matthew 14:23, Mark 6:46. That talks about Jesus withdrawing and going to be alone in the region before he then walks on the water. There's a whole series of patterns which I'm going to try and link back into Genesis 1 verse 2, which is where the Spirit hovers over the water. Jesus is withdrawn, he's gone to be alone, he's up there on this mountain, he's set himself away. And then what he does is he's praying, and he's praying from sunset anywhere to between 3 and 6 o'clock in the morning. In Matthew 14:24, it's talking about Jesus going out and walking on the water. And I'll have to find it in the King James Version so that we can get the right feel for it, I suppose.
Got it here. But the ship was now in the midst of the sea.
Oswy ways for the wind was contrary, and in the fourth watch of the night Jesus went unto them walking on the water, or walking on the sea, does it say, walking on the sea. So the first thing that sort of comes to mind there is Jesus has been away and he's cleaving to God. He spent his time in the very presence of God. And there's a later contemporary of Maimonides, one of the great rabbinical scholars, is a chap called Narmades, shortened for Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman. He's discussing Deuteronomy 11, and Deuteronomy 11 is talking about if you keep your commandments, love the Lord your God, walk in all his ways and hold fast, cleave, and the Hebrew word is dobak, to him. If you cleave to him, there's something really important in that. And Ramban says it is plausible that the meaning of cleaving is to remember God and his love constantly, not to divert your thought from him in all your earthly doings. Such a man may be talking to other people, but his heart is not with them, since he is in the presence of God, because they have made themselves a dwelling place of the Shekinah. So the Shekinah is the Shekinah glory of God that sat above the Ark of the Covenant. It's the dwelling place, it's the place where God is. So when Jesus comes and steps out onto the lake, he holds such a state of communion from his time of prayer with God that he is in the very presence of God. More so than that, he has made himself the very dwelling place of the Shekinah glory of God, and he is the carrier of it. So this is the sort of backdrop to Jesus walking on the water. This time in the mountain, cleaving with God to such an extent that the communion that he now has with God, he has made himself the very dwelling place of the Shekinah glory of God. We then get into that account in Matthew. We get introduced to the sea. And the first thing that comes to mind when I think of the sea, and both of us are ex-sailors, is lots of water, right? You got lots of waves. You're going up and you're down, you're being tossed and around and all the rest of it. In Hebraic thought, water represents much more than just water. Whether we're talking about the chaos that existed before God separated the water and the dry land, or the great flood, or the depths of the sea, Jewish thought, water represents chaos and non-order. Now, bearing in mind what we've already talked about, chaos and non-order, and how we've sort of looked at that in the functionality of the creation, and chaos and sort of non-order is a threat to human life. So before Noah, before the antediluvian floods and all the rest of it, no one had a need of any boats, did they? Because they didn't have sailors. But the first time the sea or water gets mentioned is right back in there at the very beginning, Genesis 1 verse 2. The earth was without form and void. How does the King James put it? And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. So the deep is the primeval ocean, which seems to have been there before the start of things as we know them. Without form and void is from that Hebrew tohu vohu. And according to the sort of Talmudic cosmology, this was all part of the chaos that was there before God separated and ordered the world into existence, which again goes back to link into that sort of functional aspect of creation that we've already talked about. And in some of the accounts, the way that it's written in terms of the sort of commentaries around it, it's almost like God is fighting with the seas. He's fighting with this disorder to get it back into the right place that it should be. And when you look at the creation account in Genesis, there's only one day, when you carefully look at this, there's only one day that isn't actually endorsed for being good. And that's day 2. And it's day 2 where God divides the waters. And I think that the reason for that is because one day the waters are going to be used to destroy humanity in the account. He says in Genesis 6:17, doesn't he? I'm going to bring flood waters on the earth. I'm going to destroy from under heaven all flesh, in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. So it's the very day when the waters are separated, it's that day. It's not called good. So we see God exerting his dominance over the sea, which is symbolized as rebellious and a dangerous force. Going back to Jesus, how do I see Jesus in this and the Spirit hovering over the water?
Yeah.
So Matthew 14:25, and in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went unto them walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a spirit." And they cried out for fear. So Jesus is out. He's walking on the sea. And if you were to look at one of the other gospel accounts of this, in John 6:19, it's around about 3 or 4 miles. That's that sea. So the Sea of Galilee, its widest point was about 7 miles by 12 miles. So the disciples were probably around in the middle of the lake. Now, he's walking on the water. Why is that so symbolic? Because it's a unique activity of God. So in the Tanakh, walking on the water is a unique activity of God. Job 9 verse 8 and Psalm 77 verse 19. In Job, it talks about God treading on the waves of the sea. And in Psalm 77 verse 19, it talks about your way was in the sea, your path was in the great waters, your footsteps weren't known. So this stepping out onto water speaks of divinity. Because we focus on what Jesus was doing, i.e. the supernatural act, we often miss what's actually underlying that supernatural act, which is it's actually a claim of divinity by him walking on the water. So people who say Jesus never said he was God, no, he never said, "I am God." But what he did was he made 7 I am statements in the Gospel of John saying, "I am," using the name of God, Yod He Veh He. And he's also demonstrated his divinity in doing things that are uniquely attributed to God, one of which is sort of walking on the waters. The prophet Isaiah, in Isaiah 43 verse 16, talks about the Lord God, Yahweh, who makes a way in the sea. But Jesus didn't part the waves like Moses did. He walked on them. He placed them under his feet. And it is God alone who treads on the waves of the sea. Yeah. So you've got this incredible sort of imagery from the very beginning of the Shekinah, the Spirit hovering over the water at the very beginning. In verse 26, I've read out that the disciples saw it, they're troubled, and they say, "Oh, it's a ghost or it's a spirit." And obviously in our mind, in our sort of Greek thinking Western mind, we might think of some spectre or some ghoul or some spirit dispossessed, some sort of phantom. But in Hebraic thought, the Hebrew is ruach, the Greek equivalent is pneuma. And Hebraic thought is it's the spirit of God or the wind. And if you go back to we read in Genesis 1, with the darkness being over the face of the earth, and the Spirit, the Ruach of God, was hovering over the face of the water. So what we see here, I believe, is when Jesus steps out onto the water, he is mirroring what happened at the very beginning in Genesis. The Messiah, Jesus, is hovering or walking over the water, which would have given the disciples who are steeped in the Tanakh this imagery of the Spirit, the Ruach of God, hovering over the waters of creation. So right in the front of their very eyes is the Spirit of God, the focal point of creation, hovering or walking over the waters. So I see this miracle is Jesus as the holder of the Shekinah glory of God, walking on the water. And of course, their response once he gets back on board is to worship him. And I appreciate somebody's critiqued this in one of the comments. The same Hebrew word is used for a man worshipping a man, but it's not translated as worship. So the same Hebrew word is used, but when it is man on man, it is like honor, privilege, or something like that. But when it is man on God, it is always translated worship. And if I was bowing down before you, Mark, it could be translated that I worshipped you, but the translators try and make it very clear that only God is worshipped, but other people may be paid homage. There's so much detail I could go into this. The resonance of Genesis 1 verse 2, and then this Matthew account of Jesus walking on the water, the lead up to it, the Shekinah glory of God, the Spirit of God, the Ruach of God, hovering over the water, something that was only set aside for deity to do. Just a little thought. I think that's probably given you enough to chew on, hasn't it?
I'm impressed. You did it in about 12 minutes. Well,
I cut half of it out.
Do you want to say more?
I've said that I believe the words of Jesus, that the volume of this book speaks of him. And I think right from the very beginning, if you understand who he is, and as you read the book, you can see that illumination of him in the text with patterns that are played out. I mean, the patterns are fascinating. You'll either see them or you won't, and you may disagree, and that's cool.